One editorial note before we get into this episode. Since we originally published this episode, the family of David Winecoff reached out to us. They shared critiques of True Believer as a whole and pushed back against what they consider to be incorrect details and stories relayed in this episode. So we've made updates to the version originally published to include notes about those disagreements, as well as some minor edits and additions based on information they provided us. For this episode in particular, we've corrected a factual error that the family brought to our attention, which we'll elaborate on later in the episode. However, we stand by our work and our decision to include an examination of David Winecoff's death in True Believer. He was Elizabeth Mackintosh's pastor and one of the last known people to see her alive in 1990. One of the few pieces of physical evidence found at the crime scene was David's fingerprint on Elizabeth's Knox Seminary acceptance letter. And David's own tragic death had an impact on the investigation into Elizabeth's murder. David's family has released a public statement, which we've linked to in the show notes. We invite you to read their statement, listen to our series, and then decide for yourself about the strength and relevance of this project.
He came to me with a climbing magazine and said, I want to do this, and it was an article about this new remote place in Colorado. And in my mind, I thought, there is no way that we're going to go to this place. And so I kind of politely reasoned with him and said, well, the altitude there is going to sap your strength. What we need to do is go to a intermediate place, camp there a couple days, get used to the altitude, and that was going to be the Crestone Needle. That was the warm-up. And it was a climb that, like I said, it was high altitude, but it was like walking up a hill, basically.
It wasn't super difficult technically.
Right. It wasn't. But still, I was so worried. My wife was worried. And the night before we left, my wife and I are laying in bed together talking, and she's got a grip on me, and she's worried. And she goes, why don't you just cancel it? And I said, I don't know how to. He's been looking, he intimidates me, he had that kind of personality. And I said, what I'm going to do, Mary, is I'm going to stay with him. I'm going to stay in front of him the whole way up. I'm going to watch him like a hawk, and I am not going to let him get away from me ever. That was the plan.
That's Norm Reed, friend and climbing partner of Pastor David Winecoff. In the last episode, we heard David's connection to Elizabeth Mackintosh and his apparent belief that Michael, the prime suspect, had nothing to do with her murder. When we left Norm, he and David were planning a climbing trip to the Sangre de Christo mountains of Colorado. Today, we'll hear what happened on that trip, the fallout that followed, and how, just like with Elizabeth's murder, administrators at Covenant Seminary wanted everything to go away as quickly as possible. David Winecoff's death raises questions not only about what he may have known about, but also how the Covenant community at large dealt with the tragedy of the unsolved murder of Elizabeth Mackintosh. This is True Believer, Episode 14, The Light of Day.
So, TJ, as people can probably tell by what they've heard so far, this is not a happy story. And Norm has already talked about how he was worried going up this mountain. Obviously, we've already said that David Winecoff dies in 1993. But just to wrap up that content warning, essentially, we will also be talking about suicide and some of the facts of David Winecoff's death in this episode. So people should just be aware, if that's an upsetting topic, feel free to really just skip the whole episode, and you can come back to the next episode of this series.
You drove there together or flew?
No, that was another kind of strange thing is his wife and family flew to South Carolina to be with her father and to take the kids to the beach. He flew with them, but he insisted that I take his car from St. Louis to Colorado. I wanted to take my car because my car got way better gas mileage. But he insisted, so that's what I did is I drove out there by myself and picked him up at the airport in Colorado Springs in his car. But then we switched over to a four-wheel drive rental vehicle so we could get up the base of the mountain. And so we drove up, and it was only like a 1 mile hike from the car to the...
Was he acting funny at all or weird? Or?
He was saying a lot. He did start talking about Jane a lot and how it was when they first got married. But one of the striking things he said was, "Oh, I told Jane when I left that if I don't come back," he said two things. He said, "If I don't come back, bury me with my boots on. And number two, Jane, you need to get married to someone else as soon as you can." And I was just, I didn't know what to, I thought I didn't know what to do. I was.
Would he talk about Jane often?
Not really. But, I remember him distinctly telling me about how they first got married, didn't have anything. He had to paint houses for a living. It was like.
So he's like super chatty and then saying some like weird stuff in the midst of the chattiness.
Yeah. And then the altitude, he didn't like the altitude at all. He had years before gone to, there's a camp nearby that the PCA would have every year, like a week-long camp out there. It was named after the peak that was nearby, Horn Peak. They called it the Horn Peak Conference. So he knew what to expect because of that altitude, but he was lethargic, and he said, don't worry, this is what we're here for. We're here just to get used to it. And so we didn't plan anything the next day. I kept up on him. How you doing? He's crap. Yeah.
Was he not in great physical shape?
I think he was in better physical shape than he had probably ever been in his life, but he still wasn't. When it comes to altitude, too, there's really nothing you can do no matter what kind of shape you're in.
Did he know what to expect? Had you given him any prep material?
I had. One of the things I gave him was I had a thick guidebook. It was called the 50 Classic Climbs in North America. And one of those climbs was this warm-up we were going to do. And it covered like 3 or 4 pages with pictures. And I said, I tabbed it with a yellow sticky piece of yellow, so that way he could just go up there, open it. I said, I want you to read this over and over and over and memorize it, because all of these details will be important for our success. And know what to expect, and I assumed that he had read some of it. The day came that we were watching the weather too, and it looked like the weather was supposed to turn in a couple of days, which it did. And so after 2 days of rest, we started up. And I also gave him what I call a turnaround time. It's inviolable. When you hit that time, if you're not at the top, you turn around and you go home and climb another day. And we started early, but he was so slow, and I was sticking with him on the way up. And the first 2/3 of the way up the mountain is just a steep hill. But there are a lot of loose rock, dirt hazards that you weave around, so to speak.
So at this point, it's just straight hiking. There's no ropes involved or anything like that. It's just hiking.
No ropes involved. And to this day, one of the most amazing providential things that happened on the way up, that as we were packing our gear, he was so tired. We were each supposed to carry a rope, and he was so tired. I thought, I started taking stuff out of his pack. I just left him with what he needed, like his jacket and water. Then I took his rope, and I decided, this isn't really a hard rope climb. We could probably get away with one rope. And he asked me about it, and I said, well, we're going to leave it here because it's extra weight. So about halfway up, we were taking a break, and I can't remember if it was him or I that noticed something up on the mountain, a color that didn't match. And it was a climbing rope. And he goes, look, there's a climbing rope, and it's just hanging. And one end's tied to some pitons, or iron spikes, and the other end is just down where it's more level. I said, look, let's go take a look at that. And I said, and I thought this was a good teaching moment. I said, Dave, let me tell you what that means. That means somebody got into some big trouble. It might have been nighttime. There might have been snow at the time when it happened. And they had to exit quickly because no one leaves their rope. It's the most precious piece of your equipment. No one leaves a rope unless it's life or death. So we hike up there, and sure enough, I mean, it looks like somebody just had rappelled off. So I started coiling the rope up, and he goes, what are you going to do? Leave it? And I said, no, we're going to take it with us. This is just too weird. So I put 2 ropes in my pack then, which later on, I had to use that rope to get down, to get help. And to this day, it's just blown my mind that this happened the way it happened.
So you see the rope, you go observe it, you take the rope, and then you're going to continue on the hike.
We continued on, and we continued on, and then we were starting to get close to that point where you make the transition to a rope. And like I said, you had to zigzag around stuff. Well, there were still a couple of zigzags that we could have done before we roped up, but just like on a zigzag on a road, you know how some people do the trail cuts and they go straight up. Well, there's a path going straight up through the zigzags, but it's not, it's loose, it's steeper, and we're sitting there resting. And he says, well, where to now? I said, well, we either zigzag that way or we take that shortcut right there. But I think we should zigzag. And he says, I think we should shortcut. And I was like, I don't know about this. I said, you wait right here, and I'm gonna go up the shortcut and let you know if it's safe or not. So I'm halfway up the shortcut. I hear a noise, and he's behind me. He had followed me up, and that's when things started to go bad. I had like maybe just 5 more feet to go to a ledge, and so I went up and I stood there. And I'm looking ahead to see if there's any other hazards. And I'm looking at him, and he's making his way up to me. And he's at the point where his head is literally is like where my hand is, and this is my foot on the ledge. And I turn to look ahead, and I hear a whisper, and he says, Norm. And I look back, and our eyes meet. And he looks me in the eye, and he says, I'm not going to make it. And he lets go. And he slides. It wasn't vertical. It was steep, but he starts sliding. And as he slides, he's bouncing on the rocks and stuff. And pretty soon, he just lost control of his slide. And then his head hit a rock really hard, and he was out cold. And then from that point, his body just tumbled like a sack of wet rags down, because it was steep enough that you wouldn't stop. But he just rolled slowly down the hill, and I'm thinking, I had for a moment the impulse to jump and try to out-jump him and get on the other side of him. But I realized if I did, that would be me. It would be both of us. So he finally came to a stop, and I'm yelling his name. I pulled the rope out. I fixed it up, anchors really fast. And I am trembling. I've never trembled in my life. I was literally shaking, and I had to stop for 20 or 30 seconds. I'd never shook like that in my life. It was just so ugly. And I got down to him, And
how far down from the place where he came to rest from where you had been standing on the ledge? Is it, 100 feet?
Probably 40 feet.
Okay.
30 to 40 feet. And he stopped rolling, but he was like just on the edge of something, and it looked like just a little wiggle out of him, and he would have started rolling again. So that was part of my panic. It was from that. There was something I left out, right? When he said, I'm not going to make it, I said, grab my ankle. He could have grabbed my ankle, but he didn't. Now, to be fair, if he was exhausted from the altitude, it could have been that. That's how exhausted you get from the lack of oxygen. You have to stop and catch your breath. But when you're on an angle, you're exerting a little bit of force to.
It doesn't take much to just stay there for a minute.
Right.
Yeah. But the way you describe it, it wasn't like he said that, passed out, and from passing out, he lost his grip and fell. It was more like it felt more intentional. He intentionally let go.
He did not pass out. And I'd been climbing for almost 20 years up to that point, and I had caught a lot of people on a rope that have fallen, and I've done it myself, and no one has ever had time to say, I'm not going to make it. They're usually, we have a joke like sayings where you start clawing like a mad cat, before you let go.
Because it's natural instinct.
Natural instinct.
As you fall, you're trying to.
Yeah, and your body just starts. Sometimes your body starts shaking before you fall, because your calf muscles are starting to get so sore that you just can't stay on your toes anymore. So, no one had ever looked at me and said, "I'm going to fall," ever.
So then you climbed down to him. Well, first, you hooked yourself in so that you could safely get down to him.
I was shaking so badly that I didn't even bother rappelling. I just hand over handed down the rope, because that was the fastest way to get down to him. And then began kind of a long process of, I had the one anchor that I had put in for me, but redundancy is a part of safety, so you don't do anything on one anchor. I had to set up 3 more. There weren't very many good places to put anchors in. There was this huge boulder like the size of a car, so I ended up taking the other end of the rope and looping it all the way around this boulder. And I even had to look at the boulder and decide, is this thing right on the edge that it's going to start sliding? That's what this terrain was like. I decided it looked safe. So I had him hooked into 3 anchors, and I kind of pulled him a little bit to get him up on a flat spot. I told you he was on the edge. And he moaned, but the whole time he was out cold, but then he moaned like he was in great pain. And from what I had watched him fall, he'd hit rock so hard that I didn't know if he could have had a fractured skull, broken hip, all that stuff. I tried to give him some water. He wouldn't take it. So I took the water bottle and tied like a rope around it, a sling, and connected it to his waist. And I told him, here's water right here in reach. And then I hooked him. I put a harness on him, which was hard because I couldn't slide it underneath his bum around his waist. So I slid the leg loops up, and then I took a second harness and fed it underneath his back around his waist, hooked him in, tied him in, and the knot was out of his reach.
Basically, you were securing him to that boulder so that even if he accidentally fell, he would just basically be hanging there. So at least he wouldn't fall further down the mountain.
He wouldn't have even been hanging, really. He would have maybe slid until it got tight, and it would have been like on a slope.
So he was secure.
He was very secure.
But not okay.
Yeah, not okay. And I kept trying to talk to him, and I thought it was odd that he was... But I'd ask him questions, and he wouldn't answer the questions. He was just silence. Then I decided I was wearing a storm suit underneath my clothing, and I didn't know what was going to happen to me. And I knew the weather was coming, so I stripped down, took the storm suit off. It was like a one piece all the way from the neck down to your ankles. And I put my clothes back on. I put that storm suit on him all the way up to his waist. And then I had a storm jacket, and then I told him I got to get help. I even thought, could I get him down this mountain on my back? And I decided it was too loose, and we would have both been tripping, and a trip would have killed him. So I said, I'll be right back, David. I'll be right back. I got to get help. And then I looked over, and like there's a ridge nearby, maybe 50 feet away, and I can see belay anchors that someone had left, which was just a big gob of webbing pieces, usually like 20 of them. And I realized I've got the last rope, and I can get down this mountain twice as fast if I rappel this rappel route than if I have to retrace through all the... So I go straight to the rappel anchors. I set up the rope for rappel, and I'm just about to rappel off, and I'm looking up at David, and all of a sudden he sits up, and his eyes are kind of squinty, and he looks right, and he looks left, And I yelled, "David, lay back down. I'll be back soon." And he laid back down. But that just freaked me out even more. It just looked like he was checking on me. That's really what it looked like. So I rappelled down to the point, had to do 2 rappels till I got to a ramp that it was safe to walk down, but the ramp was covered with rocks. And I started bounding down this ramp, and every time my foot would hit, it would slide in the gravel, a couple feet. Eventually, I got to the point where I lost control, and I went down forward with my hands out and slid down the gravel up to the edge of a cliff. Literally, my face is right there. And I said to myself, "Norm, you got to stop. I mean, you got to catch your breath here. Your family needs you." And so I took my time after that. But I also screamed really loud. There was this like crevice that I just stuck my head in and yelled.
Oh, trying to yell for help.
No, I yelled out of frustration.
Oh.
Yeah, I was a mess. I remember doing Psalm 23 in my head after the scream. And then I had to do one more rappel at the bottom of the cliff, or the bottom of the base of the mountain. But the anchor bolt was really small, and I had trouble finding it. It took me about 5 minutes of walking back and forth. And I didn't have any more gear, like carabiners to hook the rope into, so I had to put the rope through the hanger, which is only going to be really safe one time because the hanger can cut the rope. And by that time, somebody down below, some hikers, had heard me yell. They heard the yell, and they knew something was wrong. And I made my way to them, and I just collapsed. I was exhausted. I was in good shape, really good shape, but I had been on 120% for the last 2 hours. And
it had been about 2 hours from the time you had left David to the time you got
from the
down.
time he fell.
Okay.
From the time he fell. And that's when I started yelling, like, "David, are you all right? I got to go get help." So anybody down below would have probably figured out something's wrong. So two guys are there hiking, and I said, "I need help bad, and I'm exhausted." And I had an emergency radio at our camp, a ham radio, amateur radio. And I was going to take it with me for the climb, but I wasn't able to raise anybody on the radio before I left, so I thought that would be extra weight. So I said, "I'm going to go get that radio and come right back, and can you go up to him and sit with him?" And I threw my pack off. They put the pack on, they took the rope, and they took off. They took off up the mountain to help him. And then a little bit later, I ran into a lady before I got to my radio, and she knew something was wrong. And I said, we need help really quick. And she said, "Well, my truck's parked by your car." She said, "It'll take me 30 minutes to get to that, and the drive up was one. It takes like 2 or 3 hours to get up this road." But she managed to somehow get out in like 2 hours. So I got the radio. I climbed back up for a higher. I thought maybe I couldn't get a signal because I was too low. I called Mayday, Mayday until the batteries were almost dead. And then another guy shows up, and he's there just to hike for today. And the irony of this guy is he's a student there's a seminary down at the base of the mountain. He's a student at the seminary, and it's his last year, and he decided just to come up and pray, So he came up and prayed with me for 30 minutes, and I gave him, and then he says, "I'm going to go get help too." So I wrote down my name, my phone numbers, my wife. I said, "Call these people, tell my wife I'm okay, but, we really need help." And then the next thing I heard was a helicopter. And the helicopter came up, dropped some people off below me, went back, brought some more people up. And the people that came up had radios. And by then there was somebody with binoculars watching David through the binoculars. And he said, "Here, you want to take a look?" And I looked, and the two guys were getting closer and closer.
The two that had taken off to go up to him. So how far you're looking at David through the binoculars. How far away are you approximately at this point?
Oh, from David?
Yeah. This is hundreds of yards or
yeah,
half a mile?
Might have been an eighth of a mile to a quarter of a mile. So he was way up there. He was just a little even in the binoculars. It was hard. He was just a dot, basically. Then the guys with the radio came up and were asking me questions. And when that happened, I heard rock fall, like a lot of rock fall. And I turned and looked, and the guy with the binoculars pulled the binoculars down and shook his head. I said, "What happened?" And he said, "He's gone." And he said he stood up and untied the rope, and he went backwards off the ledge. They said he put his hands up like this and then just rolled off backwards from a standing position.
Since you couldn't see Norm's gesture there, he put his arms out wide, spread eagle. We'll talk more about it shortly, but a few days later, Norm told Brian Chappell that the man with the binoculars said David stood up rock steady. In fact, so steady that the man thought he might have been looking at the wrong person. But then David raised his arms and fell backwards off the cliff.
The helicopter showed up maybe just 10 minutes later, and they came and hovered in, and then he talked to the guy on the radio and said, "He's dead."
Because he had fallen much further the second time?
Right. Now, see, we had zigzagged up through this stuff at an angle, but below us, farther down, was a cliff, a big, long cliff. And that was that rock. As he started to fall, all that rock came loose around him and started tumbling down the mountain. And that was the clue when I heard the noise. Mm-hmm. And then that was it for me. I just wept then for like 3 days.
How was he able to get out of what you had secured in?
Well, that's a good question. The detective here from Creve Coeur, when he became interested in this and he had interviewed me and all this, he contacted the sheriff's department out there, and some of the rescue crew were deputies, and they had taken pictures. And he showed me a picture of David's body with this blue suit that I had put on him, and he goes, "What the heck is that?" And I kind of said, "Oh, don't worry, that was my storm suit. I put it on him."
So he had to have untied himself.
Yeah, and then later on, the sheriff's, I was supposed to meet with the sheriff when I got down before I left the area. And the sheriff told me his deputies watched him untie himself. And then the sheriff's office was asked to send a letter detailing their testimony. And that letter was sent to someone at Providence, who then gave the letter to me. Because I was grieving so badly, I think it's the only reason they gave it to me is so that I would know that he untied himself. And then later on, years later, I told the detective, I said, "I got this letter in my file, and I got it for him." But he still contacted the sheriff's department, and they sent him a copy of the letter too, so he knew it was real. But that's when the detective kind of, this was 25 years later, when the detective called me, kind of brought this all back to, he seemed to believe that David took his own life.
Okay, when you say, yes, it was all real, because people didn't believe your story.
Yeah. I didn't want to tell, even on the way out that day, I was thinking, I can't tell anybody this, but this is too much, this is too big a load for me. So as soon as I got back to the seminary, I had an appointment with Brian Chappell, and I told him what I saw and what happened. I've always, to this day, said, I don't believe David killed Elizabeth Mackintosh, but there was something wrong with David. And David did some stupid things that sucked him into the suspect list. And just like Michael did some stupid things. But I don't know that. I don't know that he did it. Could he have? Well, sure. I have a high view of sin, depravity. Any of us could in the right circumstances, but I don't think he did. It just didn't match the David everybody knew, that he would murder somebody. But David was stressed at times, and I could tell it.
But he killed himself on that mountain.
I can't deny what I saw. I don't want to believe it. I don't want to say it. The reason I didn't want to say it was because I had to explain this to his kids, his children, young children, when I got back. And I left it out. I gave them a rehearsed story and did not allude to that one bit because he's dead. I'm the only guy that saw it, and let's just leave it. Let's leave it alone. So I did not want them to ever hear this.
What about Jane? Did she ask for more details, or did you give her more or less the same story you said to the kids?
No. Now, I was told by the detective that he asked Jane a lot of questions, and he asked about, did he tell you to get married? Did he tell you to bury him in his boots? And she said, oh, yeah, he said all that stuff.
You just said something about David did some stupid things that got him on the suspect list. What do you mean by that?
Well, one of the first things I did, there was a third person I talked to, and that was Mark Bells. And when I went to Mark Bells, I said, look, I've witnessed some things. I've got to get it off my chest. It's not my job to decide who killed Elizabeth Mackintosh. That's yours and somebody else's. So Mark Bells then told me that night that Elizabeth, or the night before Elizabeth had died, about this letter that had been found on Elizabeth, and when they checked it for fingerprints, it had David's fingerprints on it. So that didn't help my state of mind very much.
So what do you think, Norm? So you came back, obviously, I can't even imagine. And you came back and told Covenant and Mark Bells. What do you feel like Covenant's reaction to your... Because you're not saying this is connected to this, but you're saying this might be connected to this.
Right.
And also, you're going through it. What did Covenant do with this info?
With me, they didn't do anything. I got treated with great grace by the people there as far as, I worked there. They gave me an extra week off to get over it and all pay, and people prayed with me. But it never, and plus this was something I didn't want to tell anybody. Nobody knew about this storm of thoughts that I had and what I had experienced. And the only thing I can speak to with that is it seemed to me like Mark Bells, Mark Bells was angry when he replied, not at me, but he thought that something nefarious had come out of Providence Church. But he wouldn't say who. He wouldn't say who at all. In fact, his quote was, "There's a couple of people in that church that have a bitter anger problem." And not a word who.
The family of David Winecoff believes that Mark Bells has a conflict of interest when it comes to his impressions of David and Providence Church. In the last episode, we mentioned a 1985 heresy trial in which David served as one of the prosecutors. Mark Bells was on the opposite side of that trial, on the defense. The family also claims that Mark's mental health history and legal record make him an unreliable source of information. Based on our interactions with Mark Bells and what others have told us about him, we have no reason to doubt that he told us what he believes to be true. After the incident happens in Colorado, do you then have to drive his car alone back to St. Louis?
No, there was a volunteer there that was with a Boy Scout group. They were camped next to us, and they had been out on a hike that day, but by the time they got back, they had heard what had happened. And one of those men that was a scout master was extremely kind to me, and he drove the car back. I drove a little bit to let him sleep, but I was a mess. I really did cry all the way home. And I went straight to the seminary had a psychiatrist who drugged me up so I could sleep. And he was great. And the seminary bought him plane tickets back to Texas so he could make it back home.
The psychiatrist that Norm mentioned there was Eugene Holman, the same man that treated George Johnston and Mark Bells, knew Elizabeth from her counseling practicum, and told police about Mike and Mary's domestic violence.
I mean, I'm just trying to imagine the trauma that you went through. When did you get over it? You said you got a week to get over it. When did you get over it?
Really, about another 3 to 4 weeks went by, and I realized right away that I didn't have the presence of mind to focus on studies, and that I wasn't going to make it through to the end of semester just because, it's like I had brain shock or something, and I made a decision to. They wanted me to take a lot of drugs, and I talked to the doctor about it, and some of those drugs were shutting my brain down too. So I decided to try going off of them. The problem was some of those drugs are the kind that you just can't cold turkey quit them. You gotta wean off of it. And I noticed my capacity to think and reason came back after that. But I really there was a time when I thought, I'm not going to make it. I'm just wait. This is just a waiting game to see when I crash. But thank God, I remember distinctly I had this Hebrew class with Dr. Collins, and he was new too. It was his first year there, Hebrew teacher. And my typical routine was to sit there and stare out the window. That's the way it had been the last couple of weeks up until this point. And I was doing the same. I was just sitting there kind of looking out the window. And Dr. Collins, he does have a habit of cold turkey calling on people. So he says, Norm, what's the interpretive problem here? I didn't have a clue in what verse we were talking about. So I just said, never change the text. And he goes, very good, Mr. Reed. That is the right answer. And that was my first glimmer of hope. The second glimmer of hope I had was I was doing this circuitous thinking where I couldn't get out of the pit constantly, 24 hours a day. And I had a very close friend there at seminary, and occasionally we would go fishing. So he took me fishing, and it was the old-fashioned bobber fishing and that fixed me that day, watching the bobber. Because if you don't watch the bobber, so I realized I've got to refocus my mind on that bobber and catch these fish when it moves. And at the end of the day, I wasn't in the pit anymore. That's all it took was fishing. I've told this to my friend, and I've tried to do the same with other people that I've come across that had that post-traumatic type locked in. You got to get their mind off it, but it's going to take something powerful to. But once you get their attention off of it just for a second, that glimmer of hope starts.
Earlier you mentioned the 50 greatest climbs, and you'd put the sticky note in, but there was something you had said about the sticky note got moved, or there were a couple of odd things.
That is very important because that was the impetus for me to go see Mark Bells. As I said, I was very conflicted. I was flip-flopping on back and forth with, what should I do with this? Should I do anything at all? And I was leaning more towards not doing anything, just keeping it to myself. I don't know, this could be just coincidental. But then someone who knew, or it might have been Jane, I think it was Jane, she gave back to me this book because David had it. And that was, she just said, here's the book, and I know this belongs to you and you probably want to have it. And so in part of my moments of thought, I decided to go back to that description in the book and open it up and look at it. And, I was playing that what if game, the never ending, if only I had done this, if only I had done that.
You mean like gone a different way, or
Right, yeah, and it's a never-ending, it'll crush you. That'd be my advice to anybody that goes through post-traumatic stress. When Mary came to Jesus and said, if only you had been here, he wouldn't have died, you know. Jesus said nothing. He cried, and then he said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. That's the only thing that needs to be said. But anyway, I digress. When I remembered that, I thought, man, I am playing that game, the if only game. And everybody does it. Everybody does it. It doesn't matter what sorrow you experience in your life. You second guess it and say, this is my fault somehow. So anyway, I'm looking at the book. I'm playing the game. I'm reading the description really close, and I turn the page, and there the sticky that I had put sticking out of the book is stuck on the page, and it's stuck perfectly parallel with a sentence. It says, a fall from here would be suicide. And it was right where we were. And I started weeping, and I said, I have to tell somebody this. I've got it right here. So I went to Mark Bell's and I handed him the book, and the sticker hadn't moved. And I said, here, Mark, read what that says, you know. And then I told him the whole story.
Okay, let's go back then to another mountain climbing death bio.
Oh, yeah, that was one of David's weird comments. So he shows me a book of this esteemed Presbyterian theologian, and I recognized the name when I saw it, you know, and then he goes to it was either the foreword or the end of the book, because it had apparently been published after he died. He said, do you know how he died? And I said, no. And I said, he died in a mountain climbing accident. What a glorious way to die. I mean, he didn't fill in any other details like about.
And you didn't think anything about it?
Oh, no, at the moment I was like, I got to get away from this guy.
You did think about it.
I did think about it.
And that's what happened.
Because I know, that's exactly what happened. And this is why I can say truthfully, he took his own life. And I am not the only person that's a witness to it. So I saw more than anybody. And I kept my mouth shut because I kept my mouth shut for his family. A lot of people like Jane have said, oh, David never would have committed suicide. I personally heard David preach and teach on depression and suicide, and he made a number of people angry in our congregation because he kept saying that people that are depressed and people that commit suicide lack faith. And that was absurd to a number of mature Christians, that's true. So it wouldn't surprise me with David's repetitive statements of things like that Jane would think that, you know, that I don't agree. You know, read the Psalms. You know, people get depressed, and it's real. And Christians and Christian ministers take their own life.
As we noted at the beginning of this episode, the family of David Winecoff believes that, taking everything into account, there are explanations for Norm's story that indicate David's death was an accident and not a suicide.
Another story, when your mom and David went to Scotland. Tell us about that.
Yeah, when this was kind of I guess my mom had called Bells too. Because my mom was convinced he did it. I mean, there was no doubt in her mind. And my poor mother, I mean, she really didn't sleep for like 2 weeks. She died last year, and when I went through her stuff, I found her journal. Oh, man, the stuff she wrote might be worth publishing someday, but it's my mother. I don't know. But anyway, she told him she thought he did it. So anyway.
He did it,
yeah,
as in...
And her
committed
reasoning...
to murder or suicide?
Well, both. She thought both.
Your mom thought...
Yeah, she thought that he planned the whole thing to get out of it and that used me for it. And she, you know, she's my mother. I understand that she might have got a little possessive or protective, I guess would be the better word. What was her
reasoning?
Her reasoning was two things. One was when they went on the trip to Scotland, The biggest reason was they met with Elizabeth's parents.
Who's they?
The group that went on this trip to Scotland, it was one of those planned, organized, people from the church paid a couple $100 to go on a tour of Reformation Europe with Sinclair Ferguson. And on that trip was my mother and Dave and his wife and their new baby. And as part of this trip, they were going to meet with Elizabeth's parents. And when that happened, my mom's a psychiatric nurse, so she picks up on things that most people wouldn't, but she said David got real weird, and she didn't really define that, but she just said it looked like that his anxiety went up, and basically then she saw that there was some kind of connection between whatever was making David nervous, and there was just a coldness, some kind of vibe that my mom thought was suspicious. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know. I'm just telling you what she thought. This is what she thought. And I didn't always believe everything my mom thought, but I did remember it.
In a previous version of this episode, we relayed the testimony of another woman who was on that trip to Scotland. And her memory was that David was not present for a meeting with Elizabeth's parents. But that turned out to be incorrect. David's family provided photographic evidence that, in fact, he was present at that meeting, and we're thankful that they helped set the record straight on that.
What would be your greatest outcome for Covenant Seminary in regards to this topic incident? What do you think Covenant should do?
I think the first thing they should do is apologize to the police department, or they should find out. I mean, if they were a help or a hindrance in this. That has to be first. And if that's the case, publicly say, we're sorry, we didn't take this as serious as we should have. We made mistakes, everybody's made mistakes. I guess the biggest white elephant right now is Michael. Man, if he's innocent, whew, now the guilt is with the persecution that he has endured, which I can't imagine.
I was thinking about that recently. It's a pretty black and white situation, it seems like. Either Michael killed Elizabeth, or his entire life was destroyed by the Creve Coeur Police Department and Covenant Theological Seminary in some way, and this haunted him his entire life. Man, there's a lot riding on that. Either he's a murderer, or he's a tremendous victim in this whole thing. And I don't know exactly what to do with that.
Yeah, I don't either. I don't want to think about it anymore. I've jokingly said to some people, if I could get a very precise lobotomy done, I would have all this wiped out of my head and just move on. But it's not going to happen.
And I got to tell you, I'm proud of you and thankful for you, because you know more about this than almost anybody. And what we're trying to do is talk to people that know, because nobody has talked to everybody who knows. And I feel like you've been talked to not very much now. And so it's hard to talk about it. So trauma is real.
Mm-hmm.
Trauma is painful. But one of the ways you don't get through trauma is not talking about it.
Yeah.
Right? So it's sort of the scariest thing. But you also know in your pastor brain that you have to do what you've told other people to do.
I just got to tell the truth and let somebody else sort it out. That's not my job.
Yeah, it's sort of like you've been carrying, it's not even really somebody's secrets. It's more like a weight that you certainly didn't know you were going to choose to bear. And also you didn't know who to give it to.
Mm-hmm.
I'm happy for us to be like, okay, we listen to you. We believe you, so I'm honored to be able to get to listen to you. I'm thankful. Thank you for telling me.
Well, I'm grateful that you're going to keep the flame alive, and it needs to be.
Now, let's talk about the meetings that Norm had with Brian Chappell and Mark Bells after he returned from Colorado. One of the Covenant internal documents that we obtained is a 3-page memo dictated by Brian Chappell, dated September 1st, 1993, about 10 days after Norm returned from Colorado. The memo detailed his conversations with Norm and others about David Winecoff's death and how the seminary should handle it. As you heard Norm mention, he initially met with psychiatrist Eugene Holman, who prescribed him some antidepressants and sleep medication. Norm then met with Richard Winter, who had recently taken over as the head of Covenant's counseling department, and Brian Chappell, who was still vice president of the seminary in 1993. He didn't become president until the following year. During his meeting with Brian Chappell, Norm related more or less the same story that you've heard him tell over the last 2 episodes. What's remarkable is the level of detail that Norm retained 30 years later. What he said in his interview with us, without notes, essentially matches what he told Brian Chappell only a few days after returning from Colorado, at least based on what Brian Chappell dictated in his memo. This included the story of the climbing incident in May 1993 at Looking Glass Rock in North Carolina, and David's odd behavior leading up to his death. Norm said that when he picked David up from the airport in Colorado, David was acting very strange, making bizarre comments to strangers in the airport. He said David was acting goofy in a way that was unlike him. As they began their hike, David repeatedly wanted to take the more difficult path whenever they encountered a fork in the trail. Norm said David was talking at some length about his relationship with his wife, Jane, including private matters, even about his honeymoon. Multiple people have said this was unusual for David. At the beginning of the last episode, we played a clip of Pastor Mike Milton giving a remembrance at David's funeral service. During another part of his memorial, Mike also remembered David talking about his relationship with his wife Jane during the final conversation they ever had together.
The last time I had opportunity to be with David was at Knox Seminary right before I left and went to Kansas City. David said, "Let's go into this room, close the door, I want to pray." And we talked about the various things that David had going on, his PhD work at Westminster, his work at Providence Church. He had been thinking about various missionary activities as well as his work at Knox Seminary. And he said, "Mike, I want you to pray with me over God's will for my life in the coming months." And we were about to pray, and he said, "Mike, I got to tell you something first." And tears welled up in his eyes, and he said, "I've got to tell you about Jane." And we talked a little bit about his relationship with his wife and how he loved her and what she meant to him. And we prayed. And that was the last time I saw him.
Norm told Brian Chappell about the details of David falling during their climb and some of the other odd connections that he put together after he returned from Colorado, including the sticky note in the climbing book and the story that his mother Jean related about the time they were going to meet Elizabeth's parents in Scotland. One additional story that Norm told Brian Chappell was about a time earlier that year when Norm's children reported to him that some Korean children on Covenant's campus found a knife in a box near a log cabin on the campus grounds. During a conversation with David, Norm mentioned this in passing, and David turned white as a sheet, Norm said. David became very trembly and asked Norm, "There wasn't any blood on it, was there?" Norm said there were other times that David became very nervous at the mention of Elizabeth. Because of all this, Norm was now suspicious about David's death. And here I'll quote from Chappell's memo. Quote, "When Norm arrived in my office, his first question to me, after I had expressed concern to him, was whether David Winecoff had been a suspect in the murder of Elizabeth Mackintosh. I told him I was uncomfortable answering that question. However, I assured him that the police talked with many people and left no stone unturned. I asked Norm why he asked me such a question. Norm responded that he now did not believe that David's death was an accident, but that David had committed suicide over a guilt relating to complicity in the murder of Elizabeth Mackintosh." Unquote. So all this was weighing on Norm, and he asked Brian Chappell what he should do about it. Chappell said that it would be inappropriate for him to give legal advice, but that he would put Norm in touch with their attorney, Mark Bells, who happened to be out of town that day. So the next day, August 24th, Brian Chappell attended David's funeral service, Then he and Mark Bells met for lunch immediately afterwards. Chappell told Bells that he wanted to keep the matter between the two of them, and that Bells shouldn't share any of it with the rest of his law firm. The two discussed the extremely compromising position that David's death could put the seminary in. And here's another quote from Chappell's memo. Quote, "The Winecoff family, or Providence Church, could perceive that the seminary could be encouraging Norm or his mother to scandalize the name of David Winecoff, or the reputation of Providence Church. Mark and I agreed, therefore, that his conversations with Norm should be confidential, and that the seminary should seek to extract itself from advising Norm or his mother what to do." Unquote. Here's Ruth.
Norm goes to Brian Chappell for advice and help, but then the next series of events really helps us understand why Norm feels like he didn't get enough help and didn't get the right help. So Brian Chappell basically decides that Norm can get one more free session with a counselor, and then that's done. And when Norm meets with the counselor, and this is in a group with Norm and his wife and his mom, they basically all are like, well, we think this was a suicide. And then the next part of that is not just for the kind of the internal trauma they feel of being adjacent to David Winecoff's death, and then Norm actually having to go through the horribleness of trying to find help and dealing with the body and so on and so forth. But it seems like they kind of emotionally move to, why is everybody being so weird about this? And he keeps wondering about Elizabeth Mackintosh's death 3 years earlier. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. And the problem that Norm and his mother Jean and his wife Mary seem to have, there's a line in Chappell's memo that says that after they were done with this counseling session, group session they did together, the line says, they were now angry because they feel that they have been used. And it feels like they are picking up on this vibe from Brian Chappell and Mark Bells of they're being handled. And that's not to say that the concern that Chappell and Bells had is illegitimate. David Winecoff was at odds with Covenant Seminary. He was actively, vocally antagonistic towards the president of Covenant Seminary, Paul Koistra. There was a tension there. But a lot of people from Providence Church went to Covenant Seminary. And so it's natural that they're going to be in kind of a tough spot. How do we handle this? So that's understandable. But it seems like the way that they went about it, Norm and Jean and Mary picked up on that. And they felt like, we're being handled right now. We're not being necessarily cared for or maybe listened to. We have something very serious we're trying to say here. And it feels like maybe they weren't being taken as seriously as they felt.
Yeah, the story was being shaped, right? Sometimes people who listen to this podcast get really annoyed when you and I speculate about the kind of the politics behind the seminary's decisions. I'm not trying to say it's all a conspiracy or all political, but it would also be naive to say that, sure, people are thinking about how decisions will be perceived. And especially with something as high profile as a, well-known pastor's death, and in a way that could be perceived as scandalous, yeah, people will have opinions about how to handle it in a way that's best, quote unquote, for them and for the system. And so I think Norm was getting caught in that. And so TJ, I think when I heard Norm talking in his interview with you, there's a little bit of a gap between his 1993 description, not of the events themselves, but of why he thought David might have killed himself. And so it seems like there's a little bit of a gap between why he thought David's death might be connected to Elizabeth Mackintosh's death. Is that right? And what do you think is going on there?
Yeah, so in Norm's interview with us, we just heard it a little bit ago in this episode, he said, "I've always to this day said that I don't believe David killed Elizabeth Mackintosh." And that might on the surface seem to be at odds with hey, isn't Norm and his mother going to Brian Chappell saying, hey, we think David killed Elizabeth? Well, the specific verbiage that's in Brian Chappell's memo.
Yeah, we should note that that's coming from Brian Chappell's recollection of events in 1993, not necessarily Norm's directly.
Yeah, we don't have a verbatim transcript of what Norm actually said. We have Brian Chappell's recollections of what Norm said. But the language that Brian Chappell uses, he talks about how Norm said that he felt like David committed suicide over his complicity in the death of Elizabeth Mackintosh. Norm's mother talks about David's death being over the death of Elizabeth Mackintosh. Neither of them are explicitly saying, we think David killed Elizabeth. So there's almost like a layer of removal where they think that he was involved or he was connected somehow, but maybe not necessarily that he actually killed her.
Yeah, well, and so what do you think about that?
I don't think that could possibly be known for certain unless there's some note that comes forward or he told somebody something. But based on the evidence of Norm's testimony, the testimony of his mother, regardless of whether David Winecoff killed Elizabeth, it seems almost certain that David knew something, or something's going on. Maybe there's some innocent explanation, maybe there's some explanation that's sort of related, but like just some mystery element that we're not seeing or that we don't know about. But whatever it is, something weird is going on with David Winecoff around the murder of Elizabeth Mackintosh. And I think Norm and his mother both knew it.
And just to reiterate what you're saying, TJ, it's because of the way David was acting around his death and around the topic of Elizabeth Mackintosh that people thought was suspicious.
Yes, I think David's death is one piece of evidence amongst many other pieces of evidence that you've heard over the last couple episodes. His behavior the week after Elizabeth's murder, things he was saying to people. So his death is a part of it, but it's not the only part. In 2015, during their second interview, Mark Bells told Detective Scott Worth that after David Winecoff's death, Covenant wanted to distance itself from any discussion of it. He said that resurrecting the discussion would be bad for the seminary. Here's Detective Worth talking about another tip he received around that same time from another source inside Covenant.
When I started looking into it, we actually gained some cooperation from the administrative office. I don't want to name names to, keep them safe out of harm's way or whatever. Seminaries and PCAs and governments, have large pockets, and we don't want to cause unnecessary financial burden to somebody. But they came forward and they were able to give me some information, and basically there was a right-hand man of one of the presidents at the time that basically said, the president of the seminary does not want this case to see the light of day, and everybody knows that David Winecoff killed Elizabeth. I'm like, whoa. I learned that later on, like after I started investigating this. I don't remember what year per se, but it had to be somewhere between 2014 and 2016 while I was looking at this case, that I took this statement from this administrative person that worked for the second in command and the president of the seminary of Covenant that said they didn't want to see this case see the light of day. I think it was an embarrassment to the seminary. I think it was more of an embarrassment that they hid information from the police for years. There probably should be criminal consequences, you would think, for obstruction of justice, which they totally did. Whenever someone says, the president of the seminary doesn't want this case to see the light of day, what does that mean? That means total annihilation of this case. Basically, like they're not going to cooperate. Like, that's bad. And I tried reaching out to both of those people in my investigation, and I got nowhere. They wouldn't return phone calls. It took at least 2014, without looking at my notes, it was at least 24 years had gone by without hearing this information. And now they're going to cooperate. But truly, the seminary stonewalled us. Truly, they stood in our way. I think they're embarrassed about this. This was bad PR for the seminary. And I think it's even worse PR that they stonewalled the police and didn't cooperate, and that they hid information. And it wasn't until years later that I actually found out about this statement from this administrator, and it had to do with David Winecoff. Maybe we would have been able to sort through some things a little faster, But it's hard when people play possum on you in an investigation, and you can't threaten people, and you can't threaten coercion or combative behavior in order to get an answer. You're relying on your skill set as an investigator and the art of persuasion. Sometimes that's not enough. And then when you're lacking evidence in the case, on top of stonewalling, it becomes really hard. So, the fact that this case is just not solved is not just a black eye on the Creve Coeur Police Department. It's also a black eye on the seminary for their bad behavior.
According to the case notes, it was September 2015 when Detective Worth spoke with the Covenant staff member, who was helping coordinate between the police and then president of Covenant, Mark Dalby. As we've mentioned before, several Creve Coeur detectives have told us that Dalby was the most helpful Covenant administrator that they ever worked with. At that time, Mark Dalby had been president for 2 years, after Brian Chappell stepped down as president in 2012. For many years under Brian Chappell, a man named Dave served as chief operations officer, although several people have described him as Brian Chappell's right-hand man. According to the staff member, they were having a conversation with Dave about Brian Chappell's 3-page memo concerning Norm and David Winecoff's death. Dave told the staff member that it would be a good thing if the police didn't see those files. The staff member asked him why, and that's when he said that everybody knows Winecoff was the main suspect, and that Chappell doesn't want this case to see the light of day. This idea that everybody knows Winecoff was the main suspect is something that's been floating around certain PCA circles for a long time. In fact, that's why Mark Bells contacted the Creve Coeur police in 2014 to tell them that he believed David Winecoff was responsible for the murder of Elizabeth Mackintosh. In his first interview with Detective Worth, Mark Bells said that David Winecoff was quick-tempered, had anger issues, was crazy, and may have had some mental illness. Here's Ruth.
So, TJ, you say that Mark Bells essentially came to believe that David Winecoff killed Elizabeth Mackintosh. And I will just say I've heard that theory from a lot of people who know about this case. I think it kind of just became a generally accepted theory. There were people who believed that Michael, the initial prime suspect, killed her. And then there was this other group of people that believed David Winecoff killed her. In some sense, some people were kind of comfortable with both because neither of them was in the PCA orbit anymore. I guess what's interesting to me about that too is it kind of seemed like that David Winecoff theory developed over time. I can't quite tell if anybody super specifically believed that in 1990. It seems like they didn't because the police didn't do anything about it. Or 1993, I don't know. So what have you heard?
I know that when I've spoken to Mark Bells, he does not remember when he initially had that idea. Like you said, I think it's something that sort of developed over time. I suspect that after David's death in 1993, people started to put 2 and 2 together, so to speak, and came up with this theory. Going back to Brian Chappell's memo, that's not the only documentation that we've discussed in this series. Many times we've mentioned Covenant's internal investigation in 1990 and how the files from that investigation have gone missing, except for the 5-page summary document written by Mark Bells. Only recently, I was able to get in touch with another former Covenant staff member who remembered what they described as at least one or more large accordion-style file folders, which contained documents related to the murder of Elizabeth Mackintosh. These folders were kept in a drawer in a filing cabinet, which was kept locked in what's essentially a safe room inside the Covenant Seminary administration building. We don't know whether or not those files were related to Covenant's internal investigation, but it certainly seems to be more than the 8 total pages of documents that Ruth and I have seen from Covenant. This staffer was at Covenant through the early 2000s, which was before then President Brian Chappell left. But Covenant staff who came later have told us that they never saw those folders. So, where did the folders go? Just like the banker's boxes with documents related to Covenant's internal investigation that Mark Bell says went missing, we don't know. Here's Detective Worth.
There might be some people that might be able to, on the seminary side, that might be able to shed some light on this case, but they ain't talking. If you know what I mean.
They won't talk to me, that's for sure.
No, I'm sure not. There are probably some professors, there are probably some doctors, there are probably some past presidents or assistant vice presidents of the seminary that probably know some information, right? If they're actually smart and believe in a God, which I do, I truly do, and I think there's going to be a day where there's going to be a judgment day, and be like, you had a chance to help your fellow man and you held evidence in a homicide, then you probably should come forward, even if anonymously, and just tell the police what you know. Maybe someone will listen. Maybe it will be that one missing part that we're missing in order to prove this case. Because right now, potentially, a guy's been hunted for over 33 years that ain't the bad guy. And that's a travesty in justice. And there's probably somebody at the seminary, either former student, past administrators, somebody that knows something, and they know something. And hey man, I'm just a former cop. Like, I'm not judging you, bro. But someone's going to be soon, and you're going to wish you helped your fellow man and give that information. Or maybe they did come forward, and maybe they didn't get written down correctly. And if that's the case, come forward still. Because there was one witness that told me about the secret admirer, and she said she told a major case squad investigator about this, and it was never in his report. So, and I don't think she was lying. So there could be still evidence out there, not just verbal evidence of what people have heard or seen, but maybe actually somebody has some physical evidence that might be provable to bring this case to closure too. My takeaway from this is like anything in policing, is the police department can only be as good as its community. And that's what community policing is. Without the help of the community in this thing, and people that need to come out of the woodwork and tell the truth, even if you do it anonymous, that's the only way that you can help your police department. It takes a village to sometimes investigate things like this. And if you don't have a true line of communication with your police department, then you're never gonna solve anything like this. That's the true meaning of the word community policing. When people say, well, we're community policing, we have DARE and we do picnics and we have cupcakes for the neighborhood and we do neighborhood watch. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a real line of communication where people in the community, in an environment where a homicide occurred, come forward with information to help the police. You can't rely on the police to have a crystal ball and know everything. I mean, technology's come a long way, but even DNA has its pitfalls, right? So if there's a takeaway from this case, is it's still very solvable, it's still very provable, but someone's holding on to something that needs to be revealed to the police that it hasn't. Someone's holding a confession, someone knows where evidence is, someone has something that they're pocketing, and in the meantime, while you're doing that and you're holding back that information, you're potentially hurting a person that for all intents and purposes has had the scarlet letter A put on his chest for 33 years and badgered about the country about how he committed a homicide that he never committed, maybe. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe he is responsible for it. Well, if he is, then come forward with an information to prove he is. Because so far from what I've heard, I'm not on board with what I've heard. And from looking at the case and working the case, it's not a provable situation. Let's make it a provable situation. And that's my takeaway from this. And I still hope one day that this will be solved, but I can't agree with what I seen on TV with the cold justice. Basically, well, there's nothing else that's going to move this case forward. I don't think that's true for a minute of the day. Somebody could have a piece of evidence that could prove that who the real person is that's responsible for Elizabeth's death. And maybe the murder's out there and he's listening to this. And maybe you could just come forward and turn yourself in and be like, hey, maybe this was an argument that went too far and this wasn't a planned homicide. So, maybe you're looking at a reduced charge of involuntary manslaughter. Maybe someone will take mercy on you because you didn't plan this out. Maybe you're not a stone cold killer. Maybe you're not a serial killer. And maybe it was just an argument, or you were in fear of revenge of someone losing your career or your family or something like that. And this took it too far. And all of a sudden you hit her on the head and then there was no turning back from there. So maybe this was like a involuntary manslaughter thing. You didn't plan this out. If that's the case, come forward. There's less time for that in the criminal justice system in terms of years in prison. Maybe someone will judge you, but they'll judge you less harsh because of a situation that turned volatile and you didn't plan it that way. So if that's the case, turn yourself in, bring yourself forward, tell the world how sorry you are. Obviously you did something wrong, whoever it is that did this, but maybe it was the circumstances that got out of control and you didn't mean for this to happen. If that's the case, come forward, tell somebody that, because you'll be judged less harshly, and it might help the community heal, because I don't think it ever has in 33 years. There's always been a cloud over this whole thing, over the city, over the seminary. It'd be nice to have it lifted.
I can't think of a better way to summarize everything we've talked about in this series than what Detective Worth just said there. It might help the community heal, because I don't think it ever has in 33 years. Now 34 years. There's always been a cloud over this whole thing. Over the city. Over the seminary. It'd be nice to have it lifted. Here's Ruth.
So TJ, at every point in this episode, when we talk about a potential suspect or person of interest in Elizabeth Mackintosh's case, people always ask me, well, is this it? Is this the guy? Is it Michael, the prime suspect? Is it Mike, the secret admirer? Is it somebody else at the seminary? Is it David Winecoff? Is it him? And we still have to say, we don't know. There is no good answer. And I'm not going to tell you who I think it is. And I also don't think we truly know who it is. So in some sense, people have to be willing to live with the ambiguity and understand that life isn't that simple, that lots of these people have now died, that lots of these people, you just heard from Mark Bells, who doesn't remember important things. We just don't know. And so the end of the show is saying, we don't know. Thanks for sticking with it.
And to be fair to us, I'm biased here, but at the beginning, in the very first minutes of the first episode, we said, we don't know who did it, and we probably never will. Yeah, you had this line when we were talking about what we're going to say at the end of this thing, and you sort of just said it there, but we don't have a great ending because that's not how life works. There's not a neat little bow on everything. That's not why we made this series, to hook people in so that we can keep them going till the very end, then we do the big reveal. We're just trying to tell Elizabeth's story and tell the facts of what happened as best we've heard them. And, of course, we would love to get closure, have the cloud lifted, as Scott Worth said. But, unfortunately, that's just not how it is.
I can't promise that. If I promised that, I would be lying. But I do think, though, TJ, we can't say that we've solved this case, and we can't promise that it will ever be solved, but I feel like, and I know other people feel like this because they've told me, we have learned and shared important information, not just about this case, but about Covenant as an institution and the church, big picture, and the PCA, big picture, how they handled tragedy and hard things and tough information. And so I do feel like sometimes people push back on me when I tell them that I'm not going to tell them my theory of the case, and they say, then why are you doing this? And I say, because there's still value in exploring how people deal with challenges and misinformation and missed opportunities and murder beyond just solving the murder itself. And I'm perfectly happy with leaving the center of this story unresolved, but hopefully we have led a lot more people to understand this case better and to understand how to ask good questions about the places they put their trust in.
Perfect. So good.
Yes. This is why you work with me, right? Because I'll like fudge around for an hour and then I'll have one good line.
That may be the end of our reporting on the unsolved murder of Elizabeth Mackintosh. But we'll be back for one final discussion about the impacts of this case, how it's affected those of us who've been working on it, and where we go from here. Next time. True Believer is written, recorded, edited, mixed, and executive produced by TJ Ingracia. Co-written and co-produced by Ruth Servin-Smith. Research and development by Kyle Hackman and Doug Servin. Visit truebelieverpodcast.com to see additional materials related to each episode, or to get in touch with us. If you're someone who knew Elizabeth, or have any information related to her or her murder, we'd love to hear from you.